Hey guys, tonight we start with one of the most stubbornly charming bits of misinformation in history, the flat earth fantasy. You can almost see it in your mind, rolling waves under a sky of painted clouds, the salt spray on your lips, the slow creak of timbers as the ship rocks beneath you. The crew's whispers carry in the wind, stories of a place where the ocean simply ends, tumbling into a nothingness patrolled by dragons that breathe fire and crunch masts between their teeth. Somewhere out there, sailors imagine the seas spill like a waterfall into darkness. You probably won't survive this voyage, at least not in their imagination. But here's your first surprise. Medieval scholars didn't actually spend their nights fretting over a watery cliff. In fact, most educated people knew the earth was round and had known it for well over 1,000 years. The idea traces back to the ancient Greeks, where thinkers like Pythagoras and Aristotle noted the curved shadow earth cast on the moon during an eclipse. Then there's Eratosthenes, the 3rd century BCE genius who calculated the earth's circumference with nothing more than a stick, a sunny day, and geometry. His estimate was impressively close, even by modern standards. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and you'd still find monks copying Eratosthenes' methods onto parchment by flickering candlelight. Scholars in universities, yes, universities existed, taught astronomy, navigation, and spherical geometry, the belief that everyone thought the Earth was flat in Columbus's day. That's a much later invention. Sailors of the medieval Mediterranean didn't worry about falling off. What they feared were storms that could splinter a ship like matchwood, pirates lurking in hidden coves, and biscuits so stale you could use them as hammers. You might even notice it yourself if you stand on a shore and watch a ship approach. First, wow. You'll spot the tip of the mast, then the sails, and finally the hull. That's the curvature of the earth in action, visible with nothing more than your own eyes. Mariners, observant and practical, used such signs daily. They weren't fools. Their survival depended on reading the world accurately. So how did we get this stubbornly romantic flat earth myth? For that, we have to thank a few 19th century storytellers. Writers like Washington Irving painted Columbus as a lone visionary, bravely defying a world of flat earthers. It makes for a great underdog narrative, but in reality the debate wasn't about shape, it was about size. Columbus believed the Earth was much smaller than it really is, a risky miscalculation. Without the Americas unexpectedly blocking his way, he and his crew would have faced a brutal, hungry drift across the endless Pacific. Historians still argue whether Columbus's confidence was genuine optimism or just a clever sales pitch to get funding from Spain's monarchs. Here's the quirky part. While most educated people agreed on the Earth's roundness, folktales and religious allegories sometimes depicted flat or square worlds, not because anyone truly believed them, but because they made for compelling symbolism. In some medieval art, Earth is drawn like a flat map with paradise at the edges, or as a square floating in the heavens. Think of it less as science and more as medieval concept art. Even royal symbolism reflects this awareness of a spherical world. Medieval kings and emperors often posed with an orb in one hand, the globus cruciger, a small sphere topped with a cross, representing Christian dominion over the world. You can't very well hold a flat disc in your palm with the same gravitas. The orb itself was shorthand for "the world is round and I own it," at least in theory. Picture yourself walking the narrow corridors of a coastal monastery in the 14th century. The air smells faintly of beeswax from the candles, the walls are cool stone under your fingertips, and from a side room you hear the scratch of a quill. Inside, a robed scholar bends over a map, carefully tracing a circular world onto calfskin parchment. Outside, the sea's horizon curves gently under the late afternoon sun. Nobody here is plotting expeditions to prove the world's shape. They're calculating distances, trading routes and tide cycles, and probably at some point thinking about what's for dinner. It's a little funny when you think about it. Our modern flat earth myth says more about us than about them. We like the image of heroic individuals standing against the ignorance of the masses. It feels satisfying, like a Hollywood script, and so we paint the past in broad, dramatic strokes, even if it means inventing fears they never had. The truth is, in the Middle Ages, the edge of the map wasn't a waterfall into space. It was just the beginning of the unknown. And while that unknown could be terrifying, it could also be an invitation. Ships sailed not to prove the world's shape, but to see what lay beyond the horizon. And here you are, standing on a creaking deck, squinting into the sun, knowing the earth curves gently away beneath you, and feeling just a little smug that you're in on the secret. You picture it, a knight in gleaming armor, waddling forward like a tin-clad penguin, his visor barely cracked open, gasping for air. Maybe he tips over in the mud and just stays there. The poor man's basically a flipped tortoise until someone helps him up. It's a hilarious image, and Hollywood has made sure it's burned into our brains. But here's the truth, knights weren't nearly as helpless as you've been told. A full suit of late medieval plate armour weighed about 45-55 pounds, 20-25 kilograms. That's less than the gear modern soldiers carry into combat today. And unlike carrying a heavy backpack, armour's weight was distributed evenly across the body. Properly fitted, it allowed surprising mobility. Knights could run, jump, climb onto horses without cranes, and swing swords with lethal precision. The myth of knights needing hoists comes partly from Victorian reenactments where armour was poorly made, overly heavy, and not fitted to the wearer. Some 19th century stage armour weighed almost twice as much as medieval sets, turning actors into clumsy statues. But surviving examples in museums tell a different story. Articulated joints, clever padding, and flexible mail protecting the gaps meant knights could fight, mount up, or roll away from danger when necessary. Imagine you're in a training yard. Sunlight bounces off the polished curves of a breastplate, the air smells faintly of oiled leather, and you hear the rhythmic clang of blade on blade. Two armoured men circle each other, moving with an almost feline precision, knees bent, steps measured. One feints, the other sidesteps, hardly the awkward shuffle of an overburdened turtle. The clangs get faster, the crowd leans in, and with a swift twist, one knight disarms the other. Of course, armour wasn't magic. Fighting in it for hours was exhausting. It trapped heat, limited vision, and made swimming a terrible idea, unless you enjoyed sinking like a decorative anvil. And yes, getting knocked flat could be a problem in certain terrain, but skilled knights trained to fall and recover, using their weapons or the ground itself to push upright. Here's a quirky fact. Some knights even competed in foot races while fully armoured, just to prove a point. One 15th century account describes soldiers sprinting in armour to impress visiting nobles. Imagine being so confident in your combat kit that you treat it like a gym outfit. Historians still argue whether tournaments made knights more like athletes or showmen. Jousts, for example, used special armour heavier than battlefield gear, designed for safety in impact sports rather than mobility in real combat. That's where some of the turtle movement came from. Specialised suits for controlled events, not for war. The next time you see a film showing a knight struggling to stand, think of it this way. Real knights trained for years to turn themselves into human tanks. And just like a modern athlete, they could sprint, tackle and react while carrying their full kit, except their sports involved axes, arrows and the occasional siege tower. You adjust your stance in the yard, the heat of the armour seeping into your skin, and flex your fingers inside the gauntlets. Across from you, your sparring partner tilts his helmet in a nod. You're ready, not clumsy, not slow, just a knight, balanced and dangerous, like the myths forgot to tell it. You can almost smell the stereotype before you even picture it. Peasants in the Middle Ages, caked in mud and sweat from dawn to dusk, teeth like chipped stones, and a personal aroma so powerful it could end a siege before it began. In this version of history, the medieval village is a sea of unwashed bodies where bathing means standing in the rain once every decade. It's a vivid image, and completely misleading. While medieval hygiene wasn't modern, it was far from non-existent. People washed, frequently. In fact, bathing was a structured part of life, tied to religion, seasons, and social customs. To medieval people, water wasn't just for drinking, it was for cleanliness, healing, and even pleasure. Bathing culture was a real thing. In towns, public bathhouses were as common as bakeries. They weren't grand marble spas like in ancient Rome, but they served the same function, communal places where you could soak, scrub, and socialize. Many were heated year-round and offered food and drink alongside hot water. Travellers' diaries from 13th century Paris describe steamy rooms where a man may be washed, fed, and made merry for the price of a few coins. Even in rural villages, cleanliness mattered. Rivers, ponds, and wells provided water for bathing and laundry. Wooden tubs were brought into cottages, filled bucket by bucket, and heated over the hearth for comfort. In wealthier households, servants added herbs, lavender for scent, rosemary for stimulation, chamomile for soothing skin. Imagine stepping into a steaming wooden barrel after a day in the fields, the heat relaxing muscles, the smell of mint or thyme rising with the steam. Seasonal rhythms of washing. Bathing habits changed with the seasons. In summer, people swam and washed in rivers regularly. Children splashed while mothers scrubbed clothes on flat stones. In winter, with rivers frozen, washing shifted indoors. Face, hands and feet daily. Full-body baths less frequent, but still practiced. Water was precious in the cold months, but medieval ingenuity meant people often collected snow to melt for washing or reused hot water for multiple family members. The stereotype that medieval people avoided water comes partly from later centuries when disease outbreaks like the plague led some to fear that open pores from hot baths made the body vulnerable. But in the early and high Middle Ages, the opposite belief was common. Water purified both body and soul. Monastic rules often required monks to bathe several times a year, considered frequent in a time without plumbing. Cleanliness was also religious. Medieval Christianity, like Islam and Judaism, encouraged ritual washing. Pilgrims washed before approaching holy sites. Priests washed hands before Mass. For peasants, Sunday meant more than church. It meant arriving clean and presentable. There was a social pressure to be seen as tidy, especially during festivals or market days when you might meet strangers or potential trade partners. In Muslim Spain, public baths called hammams operated alongside Christian ones, introducing techniques like alternating hot and cold rooms. The mingling of cultures in medieval Europe enriched bathing traditions with new scents, oils, and scrubbing methods. Soap was commonplace. Medieval soap making wasn't glamorous. It involved animal fat, ash, and lye, but it worked. Town records from England, France, and Italy show entire guilds of soap makers. Some soaps were scented with herbs, others dyed in bright colours for special occasions. Archaeologists have found soap residues in wooden bowls in humble cottages, proof that even the poor had access to it. Bathhouses had a reputation. Here's where it gets quirky. Medieval bathhouses were places for gossip, meals, and music, but sometimes also for less holy entertainment. Mixed bathing was common in parts of Europe, and moralists complained about indecent behaviour in the steam. In the late Middle Ages, some cities began regulating bathhouses, not because they opposed bathing, but because of what might happen after the scrubbing. Historians still argue. The debate isn't about whether peasants bathed, but how often. Some scholars argue that rural poverty limited full-body bathing to a few times a month. Others point to evidence like soap purchases, water access, and religious records to suggest much more frequent washing. What's certain is that the idea of a lifetime without bathing is pure fantasy. Step into a bathhouse. Imagine it now. You push open a heavy wooden door into a dim room glowing with candlelight. Steam curls around the rafters. The smell is a mix of warm wood, herbal oils, and bread baking somewhere nearby. People sit in half barrels of hot water, chatting as servants bring trays of cheese, apples, and ale. A lute plays softly in the corner. You slide into the water, the heat soaking into your bones, the week's labour washing away. This is medieval life. Muddy fields in the morning, maybe, but clean skin by night. And certainly not the eternal filth your school history books implied. You've been walking for hours, the cobblestones slick from last night's rain. The wind is damp, the air smells faintly of smoke and wet earth, and in your mind's eye you're already bracing for the worst. Plague carts, beggars coughing in alleyways, gallows looming in the mist. If you believed most movies and high school textbooks, the Middle Ages were nothing but a 1,000-year horror reel. War, famine, disease, misery. But stop right there, because the idea that medieval life was a non-stop nightmare is itself a modern invention. Sure, life had its dangers, but it also had music, laughter, colour, and moments of comfort we rarely imagine. The truth is, if you dropped into a random village in, say, 1320, there's a good chance you'd hear more singing than screaming. The dark in Dark Ages wasn't about happiness. The phrase Dark Ages wasn't even coined until centuries later, mostly by Renaissance thinkers who wanted to make themselves look good by calling the past dark. Historians still argue whether the label should be retired entirely because archaeological and written evidence shows thriving trade, technological innovation, and cultural exchange throughout the medieval period. Mainstream fact: literacy spread beyond monasteries, markets bustled, and farming techniques improved steadily. Quirky fact: in some regions even the sheep were better dressed than you. Medieval lords would dye their flocks in bright colours during festivals, just for the spectacle. Daily life had joy built in. Imagine standing in the middle of a market square at noon. There's a juggler tossing flaming torches, the smell of roasting meat curling through the air, a fiddler playing something fast enough to make children dance in circles. Housewives lean on baskets of apples, gossiping. Tradesmen haggle loudly but smile as they do it. Yes, there were wars. Yes, there were famines. But between them, there was life, festivals, saints' days, and seasonal feasts that punctuated the year like bright beads on a string. If you survived to adulthood, you likely saw dozens of public celebrations in your lifetime. The colour palette wasn't just brown and grey. Popular culture loves to dress medieval people in endless beige. But look at surviving textiles, paintings, and illuminated manuscripts, and you'll see a riot of colours. Deep reds from madder root, bright blues from woad and lapis lazuli, vibrant greens from copper-based dyes. Even peasants sometimes wore cheerful stripes or embroidered cuffs. Imagine walking into a church on a feast day. Sunlight streams through stained glass, scattering jewel tones over the congregation. The air smells faintly of beeswax candles, and you're surrounded by robes, cloaks, and hoods in every shade, from ochre to crimson. Laughter was a survival skill. Medieval humour could be crude, clever, or downright bizarre. Village plays mocked local scandals. Travelling minstrels told bawdy jokes. Jesters needled kings with sly insults. Laughter wasn't a distraction from the hardships, it was a weapon against them. One monk even recorded the miracle of a cow that learned to bow for bread, and he was absolutely serious about it. Historians still debate whether medieval humour was more earthy than ours, or just more honest about what made people laugh. Either way, joy wasn't rare, it was necessary. The night wasn't always frightening. We imagine medieval nights as pitch black and dangerous, but in towns, candlelight, hearth fires, and even early street lamps softened the darkness. Some towns had night watchmen who patrolled with lanterns, calling the hours like living clocks. In villages, neighbours would leave shutters open on warm nights, letting music and conversation spill into the lanes. Picture yourself after sunset in a small town. You're leaning on the doorway of a tavern, the warm glow spilling out onto the cobbles. Inside, someone's strumming a lute, the low murmur of voices blending with bursts of laughter. The ale smells sharp and yeasty. A meat pie cools on the sill. Outside, a couple of children chase each other in the square, their shadows stretching under the moonlight. Faith and festivals kept spirits high. Religion structured the medieval year, but it also filled it with community events, candle processions, open-air plays, mystery pageants, and banquets. Even solemn occasions had moments of joy, and feast days were excuses for music, games, and dancing. And there were plenty of them. In some places, over a third of the year was given to some form of holiday or rest day, an idea that makes our modern 2-week vacations look stingy. Not a utopia, but not a tomb. Were there tragedies? Absolutely. Plague outbreaks, bad harvests, and brutal winters claimed lives. But to reduce 1,000 years of human experience to gloom and doom is to erase the resilience, creativity, and joy that kept communities alive. People adapted. They built traditions that gave them something to look forward to. They found beauty in painted walls, embroidered tunics, and music that could be heard 3 streets away. And just like today, life's brightness wasn't evenly distributed. A lord in a manor enjoyed more comfort than a shepherd in the hills. But even the shepherd had moments, standing by a summer fire with friends or laughing at a good story, that shattered the darkness. You glance back at the tavern door where the music swells again and realize something. Maybe the Middle Ages weren't as dark as you've been told. Maybe, just like now, the real story is in the light people made for themselves. You step onto a dusty road, the morning sun glinting off dew still clinging to the grass. Behind you, the village stirs to life, blacksmiths heating their forges, bakers setting fresh loaves in the oven. Ahead stretches a path that, according to the myth, few in the Middle Ages would ever take beyond a day's walk. Supposedly, most people never left the shadow of their church steeple, living and dying within a few miles of where they were born. It's a tidy picture, but like many medieval stereotypes, it's also misleading. People in the Middle Ages travelled for more reasons than war or pilgrimage: trade, education, opportunity, love, and sometimes sheer curiosity. The roads were busy. Mainstream fact: while not every village sat on a major highway, Europe's web of roads and paths connected even small settlements to market towns and regional hubs. Farmers brought produce to sell, merchants moved goods between fairs, and seasonal workers travelled to wherever hands were needed. Quirky fact: cheese sellers in parts of France were known to roam for weeks at a time, selling their wares from town to town and spreading gossip as they went. Pilgrimage as medieval tourism, religious devotion drove some of the most remarkable travel of the age. Pilgrims crossed continents to reach holy sites like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, or Rome itself. The routes they took became bustling arteries of commerce and hospitality, lined with inns, markets, and chapels. Imagine walking in a crowd of hundreds, monks in sandals, knights on horseback, women carrying baskets, children running ahead. The smell of roasting chestnuts drifts from a roadside stall, and a group of troubadours sings a hymn you've never heard but somehow know. Merchants, scholars and craftsmen trade networks spanned the continent. Genoese and Venetian merchants travelled to Constantinople. Flemish clothing. Ars journeyed to fairs in Champagne. Scandinavian traders sailed to Russia and beyond. Historians still debate whether this mobility sped up technological exchange, but the spread of new ideas, tools and fashions from one end of Europe to the other suggests that it did. Universities also drew students from far-off lands. In 13th century Paris, you might hear Latin spoken with accents from England, Spain or Poland. Craftsmen sometimes travelled entire countries to work with a renowned master or join a major building project, not just for the wealthy. It's true that nobles and merchants had the easiest time travelling, but even commoners found ways. A farmhand might follow seasonal work, a servant could accompany a master to another town, and a young man might join a merchant caravan for adventure. Quirky historical note: in the late 14th century, a group of English stonemasons took a job in Norway to help build a cathedral, ferrying themselves and their tools across the North Sea. Travel's risks and rewards. Bandits, illness, and bad weather could turn a journey into a gamble, but people learned to manage the risks. Travellers often moved in groups, followed well-used routes, and relied on monasteries or hospices for shelter. Some even carried safe conduct letters from local lords to discourage trouble. Your place on the road. Back on that dusty path, you pass a slow-moving cart piled with barrels, its driver offering you a lift. Ahead, a line of pilgrims sings softly as they walk. A troupe of travelling actors waves as they pass you, their painted props bobbing on their shoulders. The road stretches ahead, not as a barrier, but as an open invitation. You're lying on a rough wooden table, the flicker of a tallow candle casting dancing shadows on the beams above you. Somewhere nearby, water drips into a metal basin, the sound uncomfortably loud in the stillness. The door creaks open, and in steps a man in a long woolen robe, smelling faintly of rosemary and something sharper, vinegar. You brace yourself. Because if popular history is right, this man's about to put leeches on your face, chant something in Latin, and call it a day. It's a terrifying image, and yes, leeches existed in medieval medicine, but the idea that it was only leeches and superstition is like saying modern medicine is just cough syrup and chicken soup. In reality, medieval medicine was a complex mix of tradition, observation, experimentation, and, yes, trial and error. They weren't as ignorant as you think, mainstream historical fact. Many medieval physicians studied ancient Greek and Roman medical texts by Hippocrates and Galen, alongside medical works from the Islamic Golden Age. Universities in Bologna, Paris and Montpellier trained doctors in anatomy, surgery and pharmacology. Quirky fact: the first recorded human dissection in medieval Europe happened in 1315 in Bologna, and the audience paid to watch it like it was a theatre show. Hospitals were more than sick rooms. We think of hospital and picture sterile white halls. Medieval hospitals were multi-purpose centres, places to treat the sick, shelter travellers and care for the poor. Monks and nuns often ran them, combining religious care with surprisingly advanced medical practices. They recognised the importance of diet, cleanliness and fresh air for recovery. Imagine stepping into one, light filtering through arched windows, the smell of herbs hanging from rafters. A nun tending to a wounded pilgrim, while another mixes a paste of honey and crushed garlic for an infected cut. Leeches were jus. T1 tool. Yes, bloodletting was common, based on the belief in balancing the body's humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. But leeches weren't the only method. Physicians used herbal remedies, poultices, cauterization, and even early surgical techniques. They set broken bones with splints, stitched wounds with silk thread, and made pain-numbing potions from opium poppies, henbane and mandrake. Historians still argue whether medieval surgery was more dangerous than helpful, but archaeological finds show many patients survived and healed well enough to return to work. Herbal knowledge was deep. Medieval apothecaries were like living encyclopedias of plant medicine. They knew which herbs cooled fevers, which soothed stomach pains, and which could knock you out for an hour so a surgeon could remove an arrow. Manuscripts like the Tacuinum Sanitatis were richly illustrated guides to health and diet. Picture yourself in an apothecary's shop, shelves lined with clay jars labelled in Latin, the smell of dried lavender, mint and sage mingling in the air. Outside, a line of villagers waits, some for cough syrup, others for a charm just in case. The influence of the Islamic Golden Age. Through trade and conquest, Europe gained access to medical texts from scholars like Avicenna and al-Zarawi, who wrote about anatomy, surgery, and disease prevention centuries ahead of their time. Their influence shaped European medicine, introducing new surgical tools, antiseptic practices, and detailed descriptions of contagious diseases. Superstition and science lived side by side. Yes, astrology played a role. Doctors sometimes consulted star charts before surgeries. And yes, charms and prayers accompanied many treatments. But this wasn't because people were foolish. It was because faith, natural philosophy, and medicine were intertwined. You might drink willow bark tea for pain and have a priest bless you because why not use every possible advantage? It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't hopeless. There were quacks and dangerous remedies. Mercury for skin problems, anyone. But there were also dedicated healers who saved lives daily. The real picture is messier, more human, and far more interesting than the leeches and nonsense cliché. You sit up on the table, the herbal scent still clinging to your skin, and realize you've just experienced something closer to medieval reality. Not high-tech, not flawless, but not nearly as hopeless as the myths suggest. You're standing in a candlelit room, the smell of beeswax and wood smoke curling in the air. Across from you, a man with streaks of grey in his beard pours wine into a clay cup. He's laughing, a deep, booming laugh that makes the rafters vibrate. And if you believed the myth, he shouldn't even be here. Because, as the cliché goes, medieval people dropped dead before they could blow out the candles on their 30th birthday cake. It's one of those facts we've all heard, and it sounds shocking enough to stick. But like most historical half-truths, it hides a more complicated and much more interesting reality. What life expectancy really meant, the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was indeed low, often quoted as 30-35 years. But here's the catch. That number is an average, and it's dragged down dramatically by one factor, child mortality. Many children never survived past age 5 due to disease, poor sanitation, and accidents. If you made it out of childhood, your odds of living into your 50s or even 60s were actually pretty good. Mainstream fact, parish records from England, Italy, and France show plenty of people in their 60s, 70s, and even older. Quirky fact, one medieval English woman, Agnes Hotot, famously won a lance fight in her husband's place at the age of 60. Why so many died young? Infant mortality was staggering. Sometimes 1 in 3 babies didn't survive their first year. Add plagues, wars, and bad harvests, and you can see why the averages crash. But survival past childhood meant your body had already proved it could endure the common killers of the time. Imagine the joy in a small village when a baby survived to its first birthday, a cause for feasting and singing. That survival was a real milestone, a family victory. Older people were respected. Elders were treasured as repositories of memory, skill, and local history. In craft guilds, older masters trained apprentices. Grandparents helped raise children, told stories, and kept traditions alive. A woman who survived childbirth multiple times was seen as a figure of resilience and often held significant influence in her community. Picture an evening by the hearth, the room glowing in firelight, a grandmother weaving while telling tales of kings and winters past, her voice steady, her hands quick. Children lean in, eyes wide, half believing she's older than the hills. Hard lives, but not always short. It's true that work was physically demanding. Farmers bent over fields from sunrise to sunset. Miners faced dangerous shafts. Soldiers risked their lives in war. But even with these risks, many lived long enough to see grandchildren grow. Diets of bread, vegetables, fish, and occasional meat, paired with constant movement, kept many surprisingly fit by modern standards. Historians still debate whether medieval diets were more nutritious than early industrial ones. Some evidence suggests that the average medieval peasant ate more fresh produce and less processed food than the factory workers of the 19th century. The myth persists because numbers mislead. Here's the thing, life expectancy numbers are easy to misunderstand. If a modern country has an average lifespan of 80, that doesn't mean everyone dies at 80. It means some die earlier, some later, and the average falls in the middle. In the Middle Ages, the high rate of early death skewed the numbers dramatically downward. A medieval man who reached 21 could expect another 30-40 years of life, barring war or plague. Women's odds were slightly lower due to the risks of childbirth, but many still lived long after their children were grown. Your medieval birthday. Imagine celebrating your 40th birthday in a medieval town. The baker sends you a sweet roll dusted with honey, your neighbours raise mugs in your honour, and a young musician plays a tune you remember from your own youth. People don't gasp in shock that you've made it so far. They just smile, because plenty of their neighbours have too. And that grey-bearded man across the table, He's 52, his back still straight, his voice still strong, proof that medieval life wasn't an automatic sprint to the grave. It's a crisp autumn morning. You're standing in a cloister garden, the scent of damp stone and rosemary in the air. A monk is bent over a large, leather-bound manuscript, his quill scratching in slow arcs across the page. If you could peek over his shoulder, you'd see numbers, long columns of them, measuring not just years but centuries. And here's the myth, that every medieval mind believed, without question, that the earth was a fresh creation, only a few thousand years old. The reality? It's more complicated, full of debates, alternative theories, and a quiet undercurrent of curiosity that pushed at the edges of accepted belief. The biblical timeline was dominant, but not the only one. Mainstream fact, yes, many medieval scholars followed biblical chronologies, particularly from the book of Genesis. They calculated Earth's age by counting the begats from Adam onward. A famous 17th century calculation by Archbishop James Ussher, placing creation at 4004 BCE, was built on earlier medieval methods. But even then, the door wasn't entirely closed. Quirky fact, in the 13th century, the Persian scholar Nasir al-Din al-Tusi wrote that the Earth might be far older than human records suggested, based on the slow geological changes he observed in mountains and riverbeds. Nature kept hinting at a bigger story. Medieval miners noticed layers of seashells embedded deep in mountains, far from any ocean. Some saw these as remnants of Noah's flood. Others whispered that the Earth's shape and surface must have shifted over ages. Historians still argue whether these murmurs counted as proto-geology, but the curiosity was undeniably there. Imagine yourself walking along a chalk cliff with a local shepherd in the year 1250. He points out strange spiral stones, the fossils of ammonites, and calls them snake stones, creatures turned to rock by a saint. It's a mix of wonder, myth, and an unspoken feeling that the land holds secrets older than scripture. The influence of the Islamic Golden Age trade and translation brought works from Muslim scholars into European universities. Thinkers like al-Biruni calculated the Earth's circumference with precision and speculated about slow geological transformations. While they often worked within a religious framework, their mathematical and observational rigor nudged the boundaries of accepted timelines. Picture a dusty room in Toledo, Spain, where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars sit around a table covered in manuscripts, some in Latin, others in Arabic. They're arguing not about whether the Earth is old, but how old and how such knowledge should fit with theology. Chronicles versus curiosity. Parish records and chronicles mostly stayed within the accepted short timeline because that's what people wanted to hear. It matched sermons and the worldview of the time. But quietly, in the margins of some manuscripts, scribes sketched out what-ifs. Tiny notes about strange rocks, unusual bones, or distant lands that didn't quite fit the neat narrative. One surviving 14th century note in a monastic library simply reads, "There are stones that seem to grow like trees, and I cannot explain it." Why the short timeline endured. It's easy to forget that in a pre-scientific world, human memory was short and cultural memory even shorter. Without a framework for deep time, a few thousand years felt immense, more than enough to explain the rise and fall of kingdoms, the shifting of rivers, the building of cathedrals. The real challenge wasn't curiosity, it was having the tools and evidence to prove the whispers true. Your view from the garden. Back in the cloister garden, the monk closes his book and looks up at the sky. He believes the earth is young, but he also believes it was created by a power vast enough to make it older than anyone could imagine. And maybe, in that quiet space between what's written and what's felt, the seeds of modern science are already germinating. The morning mist clings to the edges of a dirt road as you step out of the village gate. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke, and a cart rattles past, wheels splashing through last night's rain. If you believe the common myth, this road is the farthest most medieval people would ever go. A few miles, maybe a neighbouring market town, but certainly not beyond their small patch of land. The reality, medieval travel was far more common and far more adventurous than we give it credit for. People crossed kingdoms, continents and seas, not just for war or pilgrimage, but for trade, education, love and sheer curiosity. Travel was built into medieval life. Mainstream fact, seasonal movement was a part of survival. Farmers travelled to market towns to sell crops, shepherds moved flocks to better pastures, and merchants crisscrossed regions to trade wool, spices and metals. Quirky fact, in some parts of Europe, cheese merchants were known to travel so far they became unofficial carriers of news, bringing gossip from towns hundreds of miles apart. Pilgrimages were the highways of the Middle Ages. Religious devotion inspired some of the most impressive travel routes in history. Pilgrims walked, or rode, thousands of miles to sites like Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, and Rome itself. The roads between these sites became bustling corridors, lined with inns, churches, and traders who catered to the constant flow of travellers. Imagine joining a pilgrimage caravan, the clink of staff against stone, the rustle of cloaks, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a roadside stall. You pass knights, barefoot monks, and merchants leading pack animals heavy with goods. Education and opportunity pulled people far from home. Medieval universities attracted students from across Europe. A scholar from England might study in Paris. An Italian might spend years in Oxford. Craftsmen travelled to learn from masters in different cities, and apprentices sometimes crossed entire countries for better opportunities. Historians still debate whether the constant movement of skilled workers accelerated the spread of new technologies, but the evidence, shared tools, architectural styles, and trade goods suggests it did. Trade networks reached beyond Europe. Through the Silk Road and Mediterranean ports, goods and people flowed between Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Genoese and Venetian merchants sailed to Constantinople. North African traders rode caravans to Timbuktu. Even small villages saw exotic goods like pepper, silk, or sugar, proof of journeys that stretched far beyond local borders. Picture a medieval port at dawn, masts rising like a forest against the sky, the smell of tar and salt in the air, sailors shouting in half a dozen languages as cargo is rolled down gangplanks. Travel wasn't just for the wealthy. It's true that long-distance travel was easier for merchants, nobles, and clergy, but ordinary people also moved more than we think. Soldiers travelled for campaigns, labourers followed construction projects, and even wandering musicians and storytellers covered impressive distances. Quirky historical note. In the 14th century, a group of English masons travelled all the way to Norway to help build a cathedral, taking their specialised tools across the North Sea. The risks were real, but so were the rewards. Travel could be dangerous, bandits, storms, disease, but these hazards didn't stop people. Instead, they travelled in groups, carried talismans for protection, and relied on established rest stops. Some routes became so well used that medieval guidebooks described them in detail, noting where to find food, water, or shelter. Your road keeps going back on that misty road you watch as a caravan of wool merchants rumbles past. Follow, weighted by a pair of barefoot pilgrims and a scholar in a threadbare robe. Behind them, a troupe of travelling actors hauls painted scenery toward the next village square. The road stretches beyond the horizon, and for the medieval traveller, it's less a barrier than an invitation. The drawbridge groans under your boots as you step across, the smell of wet wood rising from the moat below. Ahead, the castle's stone towers loom against a grey sky, their surfaces streaked with rain. You duck under the portcullis and, if you believe the movies, you're about to enter a freezing, shadowy tomb where candles barely pierce the gloom and every wall drips with moisture. Reality? While medieval castles could be cold and dim in certain seasons, they were also vibrant, decorated, and far more comfortable than the stereotype allows. Castles were homes. First, fortresses second. Mainstream fact. A medieval castle was both a defensive structure and a residence. While its outer defences were all business, thick walls, arrow slits, murder holes, the interiors were designed for daily life. Lords, ladies, children and servants needed warmth, light and livable spaces. Quirky fact? In some castles, entire walls were painted in bright colours and patterns, reds, greens and even gold leaf, so that guests felt they were entering a place of wealth and culture, not just a stone bunker. Heat was a priority. Contrary to the cliché of shivering nobles wrapped in furs, many castles had surprisingly effective heating systems. Enormous fireplaces radiated warmth through great halls, while smaller chambers used braziers and wall-hung tapestries to keep the chill out. In later centuries, some castles even had primitive central heating systems called hypocausts, where hot air flowed under floors and through wall flues. Imagine sitting in a richly furnished solar, a private family room, bathed in firelight, the walls hung with embroidered cloth, a fur-lined bench under a stained glass window catching what little winter sun there is. Light came in many forms. Large windows were rare in early castles because they weakened walls, but interiors still had plenty of light during the day from narrow openings and whitewashed walls that reflected it. At night, torches, candelabras, and oil lamps lit the halls. In wealthier castles, beeswax candles burned with a clean scent, a luxury compared to the smoky tallow candles common in peasant homes. Historians still debate whether certain parts of castles, like storerooms and dungeons, were intentionally left dark for security, or simply because no one bothered to light them unless necessary. Decoration was everywhere. Forget bare grey stone. Castle interiors often featured painted plaster walls, colourful hangings, carved wooden furniture, and tiled floors. The Great Hall might display hunting trophies, banners, and coats of arms, all under a timbered ceiling that drew the eye upward. Even private chambers could be surprisingly cosy, with feather beds, woolen blankets, and chests painted with scenes from legend. Water and cleanliness. Some castles had piped water systems, gravity-fed from nearby springs, bringing fresh water into kitchens and even private washrooms. Large wooden tubs were filled for bathing, and scented herbs were added for comfort. While not every castle had these luxuries, many noble families placed a high value on personal hygiene, especially when entertaining guests. Life inside was lively. Imagine stepping into the Great Hall on a feast day. The room is bright with torchlight. Music from a lute echoes under the high ceiling, and the smell of roasting meat mingles with spiced wine. Servants move between long trestle tables, refilling platters, while children chase each other between benches. This is not a place of cold silence, it's a living, bustling household. The truth about cold, dark, and damp. Yes, stone walls could hold the chill in winter, and yes, some rooms were less inviting, but castles were symbols of power and hospitality. They were meant to impress, to host banquets, to shelter travellers, and to display wealth. You stand by the fire in the solar, watching the flames throw dancing light across the painted walls, and realise the real medieval castle was a home that just happened to have battlements. You're standing in a crowded village square, the air thick with anticipation and wood smoke. A man is about to have his hand plunged into a cauldron of boiling water, not because he's careless, but because someone claims he stole a silver brooch. If the burn heals clean, he's innocent. If not, he's guilty. This is the image most people have of medieval justice: random, cruel, and rooted entirely in superstition. The truth, while trials by ordeal did exist, they were only one part of a much more varied legal system. Medieval justice mixed local customs, royal courts, church law, and yes, the occasional bizarre ritual, but it wasn't just chaos. The law was surprisingly organized mainstream fact. By the High Middle Ages, most kingdoms had established systems of courts, manorial, royal, and ecclesiastical, each with specific jurisdictions. Written law codes like England's Assize of Clarendon, 1166, set procedures for accusations, investigations, and punishments. Quirky fact: in some towns, minor disputes could be settled by love days, mediated gatherings where neighbours tried to talk things out before going to court, often over shared food and drink. What trial by ordeal actually was. Ordeals came in different forms. Ordeal by hot water, retrieving a stone from boiling water. Ordeal by cold water, being thrown into a pond. Sinking meant innocence. God was said to accept you. Floating meant guilt. Ordeal by fire, carrying a red-hot iron a set distance. Ordeal by combat, a duel to determine the winner's case. Historians still debate whether these ordeals were truly about divine judgment or if they were more of a psychological tool, convincing the guilty to confess before risking injury. Church and crown push back. By the 13th century, the church began distancing itself from ordeals. In 1215, the Fos Earth Lateran Council banned clergy from participating in them, which undercut their legitimacy. Secular courts gradually replaced ordeals with jury trials, written evidence, and witness testimony. Imagine a case in 14th century London. Instead of plunging your hand in boiling water, you stand before 12 local men who've sworn to tell the truth based on what they've seen or heard. Punishments varied widely. Not every crime meant execution or mutilation. Many offences were punished with fines, public shaming, like the pillory, or temporary imprisonment. Repeat offenders faced harsher sentences, but first-timers might be spared if they made restitution to the victim. Some punishments were oddly creative. Bakers who sold short-weight bread in some towns had to parade through the streets with the loaf hanging from their necks. Justice was local and personal. In small communities, everyone knew everyone. A thief might be forgiven if he returned stolen goods and made amends, especially if his labor was valuable to the village, but serious crimes, murder, treason, arson, were dealt with harshly, often in public to deter others. Picture the square after a sentencing. Merchants return to their stalls, children run off to play, and life resumes almost immediately. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoring balance so the community could move on. Your place in the crowd. Back in that square, you watch as the accused man steps away from the boiling cauldron, but instead of letting the ordeal decide, the local bailiff calls witnesses forward. The process is still intimidating, but it's less about superstition and more about what people have actually seen. It's messy, imperfect, and very human, just like justice in any era. The morning sun filters through the shutters, lighting up a small wooden table where a boy scratches carefully at a wax tablet with a stylus. His mother hums while spinning wool nearby, and outside, the village priest is teaching a group of children to read the Latin alphabet carved into a wooden board. If you believed the cliché, none of this could be happening, because supposedly everyone in the Middle Ages was an uneducated peasant who couldn't read their own name. That myth is neat, simple, and wrong. Education in the medieval world was uneven, yes, but it was also surprisingly widespread in ways people rarely imagine. Literacy wasn't just for monks. Mainstream fact, monasteries preserved and copied texts, but reading and writing existed far beyond cloister walls. Merchants kept account books, nobles wrote letters, and skilled craftsmen read contracts. Even some peasants learned to read enough to follow religious texts or manage simple business. Quirky fact, in 14th century York, a butcher's daughter left a will written in her own hand, a sign that literacy reached further into everyday life than we often think. Schools in every corner. By the High Middle Ages, many towns had grammar schools attached to churches or cathedrals. These schools taught Latin, basic arithmetic, and religious instruction. Village priests sometimes offered lessons for a small fee, or in exchange for goods like bread or eggs. Imagine walking into a chilly stone schoolroom, the smell of ink and parchment, the sound of reciting voices, the occasional smack of a rod on a desk to keep attention. Universities were booming. From the 12th century onward, Europe saw a surge in universities: Paris, Bologna, Oxford, Salamanca, where students studied law, medicine, theology, and the liberal arts. Education here was rigorous, with debates, public lectures, and written examinations. Some students travelled hundreds of miles to attend. Historians still debate whether medieval universities were more about producing clergy or about expanding general knowledge, but their curricula influenced European education for centuries. Learning outside the classroom. Education wasn't always formal. Apprentices learned trades from masters, absorbing reading and math skills along the way. Housewives passed on knowledge about herbs, food preservation, and household accounts. Storytelling, both oral and written, was a major teaching tool. Picture yourself in a marketplace at dusk. A storyteller performs a heroic tale from memory while children sit rapt, absorbing history, morals, and language without ever stepping into a classroom. Women and learning. While fewer women had access to formal schooling, many noblewomen were literate, managing estates and corresponding in writing. In some convents, nuns copied manuscripts, taught reading, and even composed poetry. Christine de Pizan, a 15th century writer, challenged stereotypes of women's intellectual capacity and left behind volumes of philosophical and political works. Why the myth persists. Part of the problem is that literacy is defined differently now. Today, we expect universal reading and writing skills. In the Middle Ages, literacy was functional. Many could read aloud from familiar texts without being able to write fluently. Surviving records are mostly from the wealthy, which makes it easy to underestimate how many common people had basic reading skills. Your seat at the table. Back in that small room, the boy scratches another letter onto the wax tablet, grinning when he gets it right. His mother leans over to correct his spelling, proud of his progress. Outside, the bell rings, calling the village to Mass, where, in the margins of the sermon, people will read, listen, and learn in ways far more complex than the uneducated peasant myth would ever allow. The clang of steel echoes across the valley as you crest a grassy hill. Below, two small groups of men face each other, half in armor, half in padded tunics, while a handful of villagers watch from a safe distance. If you believed the myth, this scene would be a daily occurrence. After all, the stereotype paints the Middle Ages as one endless battlefield, where every man carried a sword and every woman lived in fear of the next raid. The truth, war was part of medieval life, but it wasn't constant. Between conflicts, most people lived fairly ordinary, peaceful lives, farming, trading, marrying, raising children, while war rumbled far away on the horizon. The rhythm of conflict. Mainstream fact. Wars in the Middle Ages tended to be short, seasonal, and localized. Campaigns usually took place in the warmer months, when roads were passable and food was easier to find. Quirky fact, knights often went home after a few weeks of campaigning because they had harvests to oversee or debts to settle. Imagine a medieval lord trying to rally his men for another month of battle, only to be told that the fields won't plough themselves. More time farming than fighting. Most men in medieval Europe were peasants, not soldiers. Even trained knights spent far more time managing estates, attending court, and engaging in tournaments than in actual combat. Farmers worked their land, merchants sold goods, and artisans honed their crafts in towns that might not see a battle for decades. Historians still debate whether peasant militias, called up in times of crisis, were an effective fighting force or just a symbolic show of unity. Local disputes versus major wars. A village feud over grazing rights could be fierce, but it didn't mean every settlement was constantly at war. Major conflicts like the 100 Years' War or the Crusades affected wide regions, but they still left long stretches of relative peace between campaigns. Picture a year in a small French village during the 100 Years' War. The nearest battle is 80 miles away, and life continues, markets, festivals, marriages, all under the vague, distant shadow of the war. Tournaments as a safer outlet. Knights honed their skills in tournaments, mock battles with agreed rules, far more often than they fought real wars. These events were part sport, part training, part social gathering. They allowed warriors to display prowess without risking the devastation of actual combat. Diplomacy was alive and well. Rulers relied heavily on treaties, marriage alliances, and negotiations to prevent wars. Entire dynasties were built through strategic unions between kingdoms, turning potential enemies into in-laws. Quirky historical note. In 1389, a marriage treaty between England and Portugal led to one of the oldest still-standing alliances in the world, without a battle being fought. Why the myth endures. Chroniclers loved writing about battles. They were exciting, dramatic, and easy to remember. Peaceful decades, by contrast, made for dull reading. Modern pop culture leans into the drama too, showing swords clashing far more often than plows cutting soil. Your place in the crowd. Back on that grassy hill, you realize the men below aren't even fighting a real battle. They're training for the Lord's annual tournament. By next week, the same field will be filled with grazing sheep, the clang of swords replaced by the bleating of lambs. And just like that, the constant war of the Middle Ages fades into the background of a life where peace was more common than we remember. You stand in the cool, dim light of a medieval great hall, gazing up at a vast tapestry depicting a royal wedding. The bride's eyes are lowered, her lips pressed in a thin, unreadable line. The groom looks solemn, almost grim. It's a familiar look from paintings, manuscripts, and stone effigies, faces stiff as if joy itself had been outlawed. The myth is easy to believe, that medieval people never smiled, that life was so harsh, so short, and so joyless that no one had the time or reason for a grin. But as with so many medieval stereotypes, this one has less to do with reality and more to do with how history chose to portray reality. Let's peel back the layers of this stone-faced legend. Why medieval art looks so serious? Mainstream fact, most medieval portraits weren't snapshots of real-life expressions. They were symbols, meant to communicate power, virtue, and status. A smile, especially a broad, toothy one, was considered informal, even undignified. Nobility and clergy preferred to be shown as composed and restrained, because that conveyed wisdom and authority. Quirky fact? In 14th century Italy, artists like Giotto began sneaking subtle smiles into frescoes of the Virgin Mary or angels, gentle curves of the lips that signaled kindness without breaking the rules of formality. Medieval art wasn't meant to capture the moment the way we think of photography today. It was about ideals, not candor. The dental reality, one reason for the lack of toothy grins, was purely practical. Medieval dentistry wasn't great. While people's teeth were often healthier than in the sugar-saturated centuries to come, visible gaps or discoloration weren't uncommon. Artists avoided showing teeth because it could be distracting, or worse, unflattering. Imagine commissioning a portrait to cement your legacy for centuries, only to have the artist immortalize your crooked molars. Better to keep the lips sealed and the mystery intact. They laughed, they smiled, they played. Despite what paintings suggest, medieval life had its lighter side. Markets were full of banter, taverns rang with laughter, and festivals often bordered on riotous. People enjoyed music, dancing, and practical jokes. Picture yourself in a medieval fairground. Jugglers toss flaming torches, children chase geese between stalls, a minstrel strums a lute while singing a cheeky ballad. You can hear the crowd's laughter roll like a tide, proof that humour wasn't invented in the modern age. Historians still argue whether certain surviving songs and plays are as bawdy as they sound in translation, but there's no doubt that wit and humour were thriving cultural currencies. Smiles in everyday life. We may not have candid photographs from the 13th century, but we do have glimpses of medieval smiles in illuminated manuscripts and marginalia. Some depict monks playing absurd games, animals dressed as people, and peasants grinning as they eat or drink. These images weren't meant for public propaganda, they were for private enjoyment, which meant they could be more relaxed and human. Quirky fact: one 14th century English manuscript contains a doodle of two men sharing a jug of ale, both with wide, toothy smiles, one of them clearly mid-laugh. Cultural rules about emotion. Different cultures in the medieval world had different rules for public expressions of emotion. In parts of Europe, overt grinning could be seen as foolish or unserious, acceptable for children and jesters, but not for rulers or scholars. In Japan's Heian period, which overlapped with Europe's Middle Ages, courtly etiquette even discouraged smiling too widely, favouring more subtle expressions of pleasure, so a serious face in a portrait didn't mean a joyless life, it meant the sitter wanted to be remembered with dignity. Special occasions brought out the smiles: marriage feasts, victory celebrations, religious festivals. These were times when smiling and laughter weren't just allowed, they were expected. Chronicles describe entire villages dancing after a good harvest, nobles throwing elaborate masquerades, and children running through the streets with flowers in their hair. Imagine the warmth of a candlelit wedding feast, roasted meats, sweet pastries, barrels of ale, and music so lively you can't help but sway. Someone makes a joke, and even the lord of the manor, stone-faced in his official portrait, throws back his head and laughs. The evolution of the smile in art. It wasn't until the Renaissance that smiling began to appear more often in formal portraiture, partly because of changing artistic goals. Renaissance artists aimed for more lifelike depictions, influenced by classical Roman art, which included more relaxed expressions. That's how we eventually got to the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa in the early 16th century, a work that would have seemed almost scandalously casual to many medieval patrons. Why the myth persists. We tend to believe what we see, and when most surviving medieval imagery shows unsmiling faces, it's easy to assume that was the norm. Add to that the popular notion of the dark Middle Ages full of plague, famine, and war, and smiling seems almost out of place. But a single image can't represent an entire lived reality. If future historians judged us only by our passport photos, they might think we never smiled either. Your place at the feast. Back in the Great Hall, the tapestry still shows the solemn royal couple, but as the wedding feast begins, you see the real scene unfold, guests leaning close, whispering jokes, goblets clinking, cheeks flushed with wine and laughter. The groom grins as a minstrel sings a playful verse about his new bride, and she hides her smile behind a jeweled hand. The myth of the joyless Middle Ages fades, replaced by something warmer and more familiar. A reminder that human joy is timeless, even if the official record prefers to keep a straight face. The rain drums steadily on the thatched roof above your head as you step into the warm glow of a medieval tavern. The smell of spiced ale and roasting meat mingles with the low hum of voices. In the corner, a group of merchants laughs over a game of dice. Outside, children are chasing each other through puddles. It's a scene that already challenges the myth you've heard your whole life, that the Middle Ages were nothing but unending misery. According to the stereotype, people in this era lived in filth, starved constantly, and faced only war, plague, and oppression. But while those hardships did exist and could be devastating, they weren't the only reality. Life was as layered and varied then as it is now, filled with both suffering and joy. Hardship was real, but not universal. Mainstream fact: yes, medieval life could be dangerous. Outbreaks of plague, poor harvests, and conflicts could change lives overnight. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 and the Black Death of the mid-14th century were genuine disasters that reshaped societies. Quirky fact, in some years and regions, harvests were so good that food prices fell, wages rose, and festivals multiplied. Surviving records from certain towns in 14th century France describe a season of abundance where bakers sold enormous loaves for pennies and taverns stayed open all night during market week. Everyday life had comfort and joy. When crops were good and peace held, life could be comfortable, especially for skilled artisans, merchants, and successful farmers. People built homes, planted gardens, kept livestock, and participated in a rich calendar of religious and secular celebrations. Imagine standing in a medieval kitchen, bread baking in a clay oven, stew simmering with herbs from the garden, and the warm chatter of family members working side by side. Work, community, and leisure. Worked. Days were long, but they weren't relentless. The church calendar mandated numerous feast days, often accompanied by communal meals, music, and games. Seasonal fairs brought people together to trade, socialize, and court. Evenings might be spent telling stories by the fire, playing music, or enjoying a mug of ale with neighbors. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had more leisure time than modern workers, but the sheer number of holy days suggests they weren't toiling every day from dawn to dusk. Health and medicine were not hopeless. While medieval medicine lacked the precision of modern science, it wasn't completely ineffective. Herbal remedies, midwifery, and surgical techniques like setting bones or draining abscesses often saved lives. Monastic infirmaries kept written records of treatments, and some remedies, like honey for wound care, are still valued today. The power of story, music, and art. Art, music, and literature weren't luxuries reserved for kings and bishops. Travelling minstrels performed in villages, local craftsmen decorated churches with colourful carvings, and illuminated manuscripts sometimes included humorous doodles alongside religious text. Quirky note? Some surviving manuscripts feature animals playing musical instruments or peasants dancing in ways that look suspiciously modern, clear signs that humour thrived even in sacred spaces. Why the myth persists. The myth of constant misery comes from two places: the chroniclers who recorded disasters far more eagerly than ordinary years, and the later Romantic and Victorian fascination with the Dark Ages as a time of suffering. Popular culture, films, TV, novels, has kept the gloom alive because it makes for dramatic storytelling. But real life was balanced. For every year of famine, there might be several of relative prosperity. For every war, there were stios, etches of peace. For every tragedy, moments of joy. Your place in the tavern. Back in that warm tavern, you sip your ale while listening to a merchant spin a story about a trading trip gone wrong in the most ridiculous way. A boy bursts in from the rain, dripping but grinning, clutching a wooden toy. Across the room, someone starts singing a familiar tune, and the crowd joins in. The myth of endless misery fades, replaced by something richer. A recognition that even in the hardest centuries, people found ways to live, laugh, and love. The fire crackles low, its light painting slow-moving shadows on the wall. Outside, the rain has softened to a gentle mist, and the clatter of hooves on the road grows faint as the last travellers pass by. You lean back, feeling the weight of the day melt away, and picture the long arc of history you've just walked through, misconceptions, half-truths, and stories more complicated than they first appeared. The Middle Ages were not a single mood, not a frozen image of misery or gloom. They were centuries of contrasts, harsh winters and abundant harvests, solemn rituals and rowdy fairs, the clash of armies and the laughter of weddings. People smiled, sang, argued, dreamed. They endured loss, and they celebrated life. The candle on the table burns lower, its pool of light shrinking, pulling the room into a soft embrace of shadow. You think of the pilgrims on the road, the scholars in their studies, the craftsmen at their benches. You think of children playing in muddy streets and nobles dancing in candlelit halls. All of it, war and peace, sorrow and joy, woven together into the tapestry of an age. Your eyes grow heavier with each flicker of the flame. Outside, the mist thickens, muffling the last sounds of the night until all that's left is the hush of your own breathing. And as you drift towards sleep, you carry one last thought, that history, like life, is never just one thing. It's not all Siri nor all joy. It's the space in between where the truest stories live. Good night, traveller. Sweet dreams.